Senator Marco Rubio joins us at the Heritage Foundation to talk about why Cuba needs a technological revolution. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, how does Cuba make this technological leap, especially when its communist leaders won't allow its citizens to even have the most basic internet access?
Well, Castro's Cuba is never going to do that because they can't survive it. The bottom line is that a totalitarian regime like theirs can't survive a technological opening. If the people of Cuba have the ability to communicate with each other and the outside world and to receive information in real time, not just about what's happening on the island, but about the opportunities that people have all over the planet, the Castro government wouldn't last but a few months. And they know that. And so what I think you're seeing in Cuba is they're trying to figure out how can they extract the maximum amount of revenue out of technological openings, but not open up so much that it could cost them their grip on power. And it's that balancing act that those of us who aspire for freedom and liberty in Cuba are trying to unbalance in favor of liberty and against totalitarianism.
Now, the Pope will visit Cuba next week. What are your hopes and expectations, and should he visit with dissidents while he's there?
Yes, he should visit with dissidents. I think it's impossible to visit an island like Cuba where you have so many people who have their basic human rights being oppressed on a daily basis and not acknowledge that in some way. And look, what we're hopeful for is that a Pope would visit Cuba and speak forcefully about these things, about fundamental human rights and human liberties that are being violated systematically, about the fact that dissidents and opposition to the government, they're rounding them up on the streets, so that they've basically sent a very clear message that no type of protest will be tolerated while the Pope is visiting Cuba. I think for the Pope to visit Cuba and not acknowledge this in some way would be a real travesty, and I hope that's not what happens.
Now, turning to domestic issues, Chairman Paul Ryan issued his budget yesterday. You're a supporter of cut, cap, and balance. Is it possible to balance the budget in 10 years?
I think it's possible. I mean, the question is whether it's politically doable, and that's a much different question, but I think it's certainly possible to do, and that should be our goal. Ultimately, I congratulate Paul Ryan. I've asked, what do I feel about the budget? My answer is, compared to what? There is no contrasting budget. I mean, the Democrats in the Senate aren't going to produce a budget, and they can't produce a budget. And the reason why they can't is because they have no plans and no ideas about how to save Medicare, how to fix our tax code, how to spend less money than we take in, or at least no more than we take in. They have no concrete ideas about how to do that. The radical left-wing elements of their party won't allow them to tackle these issues in a meaningful way. And so the result is you're never going to get, it's been 1,000 some odd days since Democrats in the Senate produce a budget, and I don't think that's going to change this year either.
This week is the 2-year anniversary of Obamacare. Next week, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments. Mm-hmm. Will there be a third anniversary?
Well, our hope is that one of two things will happen. Number one, it'll get thrown out for being unconstitutional on a number of grounds, and that's what the hearings will be about next week before the Supreme Court. And the other hope is that somehow we'll have a new majority here in Washington that will repeal and replace it with something better. We definitely need to address the health insurance problem in America, but doing it Obamacare way has been detrimental to our economy, and it's still killing jobs 2 years into its semi-implementation.
Now, one issue that's flared up with Obamacare recently is the debate over religious liberty.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about the president's framing of this issue as a war on women?
Well, I mean, number one is this is very clear. This is a president that can't run on his record. President Obama cannot run on his record because everything in America is worse today than it was when he took over 3 years ago. So if you can't run on your record, you got to hope to make the election about something else. And what he has done, in contrast to 2008, is this president is now systematically trying to pit Americans against each other. So it's women against men, it's even Hispanics against each other, it's poor against rich, the haves versus the have-nots, business versus small business, etc. It's just a systematic effort to divide Americans against each other in a way no modern political figure has ever done in American history, in hopes of getting to 51% and winning his election. That's all he cares about right now. So I think it's very, very sad. Meanwhile, a fundamental religious liberty is being violated.
And finally, you have a memoir coming out in June in which you talk about conservatism. What is it that drew you to conservatism, and why are you a conservative?
Well, it's very simple. What drew me to conservatism is the story of my parents, my grandparents, and my upbringing. And the fact of the matter is that my dad and my grandfather were smart men. They worked very hard. They had their own ambitions. But I was able to accomplish dreams that they were not. And the biggest difference between the way I grew up and the way they grew up is I got to grow up in America, in the single greatest society in human history, in a place of not just personal, political, individual liberties, but a place of free enterprise. And if it weren't for those two things, I probably wouldn't have gotten much further than my dad or my grandfather got. So that makes us different from the rest of the world. I think that's what conservatism is all about, is those two principles. And I want my children to grow up in the same kind of country.